The wedding had been nothing short of perfect. A grand ceremony, a lavish reception, and a bride and groom who seemed to be madly in love. Guests had danced under twinkling lights, toasting to a future filled with happiness, unaware that beneath the surface, a secret was already unraveling. Olivia Bennet had walked down the aisle in an exquisite white gown, her smile radiant as she took the hand of her new husband, James Carter. To everyone watching, it was a love story straight out of a fairy tale, two high school sweethearts, finally tying the knot after years of devotion. But fairy tales often hide the darkest truths, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, the dream had turned into a nightmare. Somewhere between the first dance and the last toast, Olivia had made a choice, one that would shatter lives and lead to a horrifying end. As the celebration stretched into the late hours, the champagne flowed freely. Laughter echoed through the grand estate, and emotions ran high. But behind closed doors, away from the joyful crowd, whispers of betrayal took form. The best man, Ethan Graves, had always been close to Olivia. Too close. Friends since college, there had always been speculation, rumors of a spark between them that had never quite burned out. James had brushed it off, trusted his bride, believed in the love they had built. But trust is a fragile thing, and that night, in the shadows of a grand estate, meant to symbolize forever, it was broken beyond repair. No one knew exactly when it happened, when Olivia slipped away from the festivities, when Ethan followed her into the dimly lit corridors of the mansion. Was it planned? A moment of reckless passion? Or had old feelings resurfaced at the worst possible time? The details remained hazy, but what was clear was that Olivia and Ethan were together, alone, when they never should have been. Somewhere between the stolen glances and whispered words, the line between right and wrong disappeared. And as the clock inched closer to midnight, the weight of that betrayal began to spiral into something far more sinister. The next morning, the mansion was eerily silent. The leftover decorations fluttered in the soft morning breeze, remnants of a celebration that had ended too soon. The staff moved through the halls, tidying up, preparing for the day ahead. But then a scream, shattering the quiet, piercing through the stillness. A bridesmaid, pale and trembling, stumbled into the grand hall, her eyes wide with terror. And in the bridal suite, where Olivia should have been waking up to the first morning of her married life, there was only horror, blood-stained sheets, a shattered mirror, a wedding dress discarded on the floor like a forgotten relic, and lying motionless in the center of it all, one of them. But was it the bride? The best man? Or had the groom discovered the truth before it was too late? The mansion had once been filled with celebration, but now it felt haunted, its grand halls echoing with silence, heavy with the weight of something unspeakable. As police arrived at the scene, weaving through panicked guests and shaken staff, the crime scene unfolded before them like a macabre puzzle. The bridal suite, once pristine, was now a place of violence, blood smeared across the silk sheets, a wineglass shattered on the floor, its crimson contents blending with something far darker. The body lay motionless, the lifeless form of someone who, just hours before, had been part of a love story that was supposed to last forever. But love had soured into something else, something deadly. James Carter, the groom, sat in the adjoining room, his hands gripping his temples, his tuxedo still stained with last night's celebration. His expression was unreadable shock, grief, maybe even something darker lingering beneath. The officers pressed him for answers, but his responses were clipped, his memory hazy. He had been drinking, celebrating, blissfully unaware that the woman he had just vowed to spend his life with had slipped away into the arms of another man. But what had happened when he found out? Had he walked in on them? Had rage overtaken him in a blind, uncontrollable fury? Or had he been asleep in his own bed, oblivious, while a far more calculated killer had done their work in the dead of night? Then there was Olivia, the radiant bride, who'd been the center of it all. But the image of the beautiful, blushing newlywed was beginning to crack. Beneath the surface of her perfect smile, whispers of deception painted a more complicated picture. Some of the bridesmaids recalled hushed conversations, stolen glances, and lingering tension between Olivia and Ethan, the best man. Others spoke of a strange shift in her demeanor just days before the wedding, a restlessness, a hesitation, as if she was standing at the edge of something she wasn't ready for. Had she been second-guessing her marriage to James? Was she in love with someone else? Or had she simply made a reckless mistake that cost someone their life? Ethan Graves had always been a fixture in their lives. A longtime friend, charming and confident, the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. He had been James's best man, but had he secretly been Olivia's true love? Some guests had noticed the way he watched her during the ceremony, an unreadable expression flickering across his face when she said "I do." Others had seen him slip away from the reception around the same time Olivia had disappeared. But now, Ethan was missing. His tuxedo jacket had been found in the hallway outside the bridal suite, his cufflink abandoned near the broken glass. And yet, no one had seen him since the night before. Had he run? Had he been taken? Or was he the one lying in that room, lifeless and still? Then there was the question no one wanted to ask out loud: what if someone else had been involved? The guest list had been long, the venue sprawling, filled with places for secrets to hide. Olivia's parents had never approved of James, their wealth and influence making them accustomed to getting what they wanted. Was it possible they had done something drastic to keep their daughter from making what they saw as a mistake? And what about James's family? His brother Lucas had always been protective, always suspicious of Olivia's commitment. Had he taken matters into his own hands to protect his brother from a devastating betrayal? As the investigation deepened, the once perfect wedding unraveled into a tangled web of deception, jealousy, and long-buried tensions. Everyone had a motive. Everyone had secrets. And as the morning sun illuminated the crime scene, it became clear this wasn't just a crime of passion. This was something far more sinister. The investigation should have been straightforward. A crime of passion, a wedding night gone horribly wrong. Someone had snapped, and now there was blood on their hands. But as detectives combed through the evidence, things didn't add up the way they should have. The security footage from the mansion had been tampered with. Not erased completely, but distorted frames missing, timestamps jumping erratically, as if someone had carefully cut out the most incriminating moments. Whoever had done it wasn't just covering their tracks. They wanted to control the narrative, to make sure only parts of the truth came to light. James remained under intense scrutiny, his shaken demeanor doing little to clear his name. His alibi was weak. He claimed he had blacked out from drinking, waking up only when the screams filled the mansion. But when the police examined his tuxedo, they found something unsettling. A faint smudge of blood on his sleeve, barely visible against the fabric, almost as if someone had tried to clean it. James swore he had no memory of how it got there, and for a moment, even he seemed to doubt himself. Had he been so consumed by rage that he had done the unthinkable and simply forgotten? Or was someone setting him up? Then there was Olivia's past details that had once seemed trivial, but now carried an ominous weight. A year before the wedding, she had briefly called off the engagement, something most of the guests had dismissed as cold feet. But what no one had known was that during that time, she had reconnected with Ethan. Their friendship had never fully faded, and there had been rumors, late-night texts, secret meetings, a lingering tension between them that had never truly disappeared. James had eventually won her back, but had Olivia truly moved on? Or had she carried a dangerous secret into her marriage, one that had been exposed at the worst possible moment? And then, a new problem emerged: Ethan's disappearance. The longer he remained missing, the more his absence became suspicious. Was he on the run, Because he had something to hide? Or was he the victim, taken out before he could reveal what really happened that night? His car was still parked outside the mansion, his phone abandoned on the balcony where he had last been seen. But there was no trace of him, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest where he had gone or who had taken him. The best man had simply vanished into thin air. As detectives pushed deeper, witnesses began to change their stories. A bridesmaid who had sworn she saw Olivia slip away alone now hesitated, claiming she might have been mistaken. The mansion staff, who had initially been cooperative, suddenly became tight-lipped, as if someone had warned them to stay silent. And then, a threatening message appeared scrawled in red lipstick across the mirror in the bridal suite. "Let it go, or you're next." Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to get away with murder. They were making sure no one uncovered the truth. And now, the question was no longer just who had done it, but how far they were willing to go to keep their secret buried. The message scrawled across the mirror in red lipstick was a warning, but also a challenge. Someone wanted the investigation to stop, to let the truth remain buried beneath the weight of secrets and lies. But the deeper the detectives dug, the more they realized that this wasn't just about a crime of passion. It was something far more layered, something that stretched back further than just the wedding night. And then, just as fear and uncertainty gripped the mansion, another message appeared, this time, not in the bridal suite, but on the windshield of a bridesmaid's car. 3 words, hastily written in dust across the glass. "You saw nothing." The bridesmaid, Lauren, had been one of Olivia's closest friends, part of the tight-knit circle that had known her long before she became Mrs. Carter. But now, Lauren was trembling, her hands shaking as she read the words, her mind racing back to the night before. Had she seen something she wasn't supposed to? Something she had forced herself to forget in the chaos of the morning. She remembered stumbling upstairs after too many glasses of champagne, looking for Olivia. She had heard voices low, hushed, urgent, coming from behind a locked door. At the time, she had assumed it was Olivia and James having a private conversation, maybe even an argument. But now, with Ethan missing and a body left behind, she wasn't so sure. The voices she had heard, one of them, had been Olivia's. But the other? It hadn't been James or Ethan. It had been someone else. Someone she couldn't quite place. Meanwhile, the investigation into the missing security footage revealed something even more troubling. A digital forensics expert had managed to recover a few corrupted frames, brief, blurry images that flickered in and out like a half-remembered nightmare. The footage showed a figure entering the bridal suite sometime after midnight, but the face was obscured. A second figure followed moments later, and then a struggle. But before anything more could be seen, the video glitched, cutting out completely. What was clear, though, was that at least 2 people had been inside that room when the murder took place. And if that was the case, then nothing about the crime was as simple as it seemed. As if the night hadn't been shrouded in enough mystery, a shocking revelation surfaced from the medical examiner's preliminary report. The victim, whose identity the police had yet to publicly confirm, had defensive wounds, meaning they had fought back. But the most chilling discovery, underneath their fingernails, there was a trace of something unexpected: fabric, torn from a piece of clothing. Not a tuxedo, not a wedding dress, but something silk, something dark, something that didn't belong to the bride, the groom, or the missing best man. Someone else had been in that room, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And now, that person was walking free, knowing that the walls were closing in. As the mansion remained locked down, tension crackled in the air. Unspoken accusations and suspicious glances exchanged between guests who had once been laughing together just hours before. No one was above suspicion anymore. James, shaken and lost in his own grief and confusion, began to question everything he thought he knew about his wife. Had Olivia been keeping secrets from him long before the wedding? Had she been involved in something far more dangerous than an affair? Or worse, had she known this would happen all along? With Ethan still missing, a body lying in the morgue, and the real killer slipping further into the shadows, one thing became disturbingly clear: this wasn't just about betrayal. This was about something that had been planned. And if someone had gone to such lengths to cover it up, then the night's darkest secrets were still waiting to be uncovered. The weight of the night's horrors had settled over James like a suffocating fog, but the fear truly sank in when he realized he was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a feeling creeping along his spine, a sense that every time he turned, someone had just looked away. The officers moving through the mansion were focused on their work, but among the remaining guests, there was something else: shifting eyes, hushed whispers, stolen glances that made his skin prickle. It wasn't just paranoia. Someone was keeping tabs on him, waiting to see what he would do next. And then, just when the dread started gnawing at him, something even more chilling happened. Lauren, the bridesmaid who had received the warning, was gone. One moment, she had been there, pale and trembling, as she whispered to James about the voices she had heard the night before. She had been on the verge of remembering, swearing there had been a second man in Olivia's room, someone whose voice she almost recognized. But then, the power had flickered, plunging the mansion into a few seconds of eerie darkness. When the emergency lights kicked in, Lauren was nowhere to be found. Her phone was left behind on a side table, her purse untouched, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. But James knew better. Someone had taken her. The police quickly searched the mansion, calling out her name, but there was no answer. Guests were questioned, the staff grilled, but no one had seen anything. The security cameras, already compromised, offered no clues. It was as if the moment she started remembering, someone had decided she needed to disappear. And that meant whoever was behind this was still in the house, moving among them, erasing evidence, silencing anyone who got too close to the truth. James felt the panic claw at his chest, but beneath it, something else boiled: rage. This wasn't just about Olivia's betrayal anymore. This was something deeper, something planned. And he had walked right into it. The past few hours blurred in his mind, the blood on his sleeve, the missing footage, Ethan's sudden disappearance, Lauren's cryptic warning. It all felt connected, like an invisible thread tying each of them to a secret none of them had even realized they were part of. Then, another message appeared. This time, not on a mirror or a windshield, but slipped under James's door. A single sheet of paper, creased as if it had been clutched in a trembling hand. 4 words, written in a rushed scrawl: "You should have left." James stared at it, his pulse hammering, his breath shallow. The walls of the mansion felt smaller now, the air heavier. Someone didn't just want him to stop digging. They wanted him gone. Or worse, they wanted him to be next. James's fingers clenched around the note, the words searing into his mind like a brand. You should have left. Someone wanted him to believe he was in over his head, that he was just another loose end, waiting to be tied up. But fear gave way to something else: determination. He wasn't running. Not now. Not until he knew the truth. And then, just as his mind spun with questions, a voice shattered the silence behind him. I tried to warn her. James turned sharply, his heart pounding. It was Daniel, the quiet, unassuming groomsman who had barely spoken all night. He stood in the dim light of the hallway, his face drawn, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his suit. He looked nothing like the relaxed, easygoing friend James had known for years. There was something raw in his expression, something haunted. Before James could speak, Daniel exhaled sharply and shook his head. She didn't listen. None of you did. James narrowed his eyes, a sick feeling twisting in his gut. What are you talking about? Daniel hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before stepping closer, lowering his voice. Olivia wasn't supposed to marry you. The words hit like a slap, but before James could react, Daniel continued, his voice tight with urgency. She was in too deep, man. She tried to pull away, to start over, but they wouldn't let her. That's why she called off the wedding last year. Not because of you, because of them. The walls felt like they were closing in. James had spent the last few hours believing Olivia had been unfaithful, believing her betrayal had set off the events that led to her murder. But this was something else entirely. His mind reeled as he tried to grasp what Daniel was saying. Them? Who the hell was them? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. I don't know everything, but I know she was trying to get out. She was involved in something before you, something she never talked about. But she was scared, James. She was really scared. She thought she could walk away, that marrying you would make it all go away. But it doesn't work like that. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, his fear seeping through. Someone made sure she couldn't leave. James felt cold all over. He had spent the last few hours questioning everything about Olivia, her loyalty, her choices, her secrets. But now a terrifying realization gripped him. What if Olivia hadn't betrayed him? What if she had been running for her life? And what if whoever had killed her wasn't after revenge, but control? His pulse thundered as pieces of the puzzle shifted, forming a new, more sinister picture. This wasn't just about infidelity. This wasn't about a jealous lover or a crime of passion. This was about something Olivia had been running from long before she ever walked down the aisle. And now, whoever had silenced her wasn't done cleaning up their mess. James swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he met Daniel's gaze. Who were they? Daniel hesitated, his face pale. I don't know. But I think Ethan did. The words sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over James. Ethan missing, unreachable, possibly dead. Had he uncovered the truth Olivia had been hiding? Was that why he had vanished? Had he been trying to warn James all along? Or worse, had he been part of it? Before James could press for more, a loud noise erupted downstairs, a crash, followed by the distant sound of voices raised in panic. Daniel flinched, stepping back. They know we're talking. James barely had time to process the warning before Daniel turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving James standing there, gripping a note that suddenly felt like a death sentence. The truth was unraveling, but with every answer came a new, more terrifying question. And now, he wasn't just searching for the truth, he was trying to stay alive long enough to uncover it. James barely had time to think before the shouting downstairs grew louder, followed by a rush of footsteps. He could feel the tension shift, the air thick with an urgency that told him something had just gone terribly wrong. His grip tightened around the crumpled note in his hand as he moved toward the staircase, his heart hammering so hard it almost drowned out the noise below. He expected chaos, panic, but what he didn't expect was the look on Detective Hale's face when their eyes met across the dimly lit foyer. There was no longer controlled suspicion in her gaze. There was certainty. Cold, unforgiving, and it was aimed right at him. James Carter, her voice rang out, steady but sharp. You need to come with us. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward him. The guests, who remained shell-shocked, exhausted, watched in silence, their faces pale and unreadable. The officers flanking Hale stepped forward, and that's when James saw it. The zip-tie cuffs. His stomach turned to stone. What the hell is this? James demanded, but even as he spoke, he knew. He didn't need to ask. Whatever had just happened, whatever new evidence had come to light, it had led them to him. Hale's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. Pity? Regret? It made his skin crawl. We have reason to believe you're withholding information. We recovered a second murder weapon, one with your fingerprints on it. James felt the room tilt. His mind screamed that it wasn't possible, that this was a mistake, but the logical part of him knew this wasn't a bluff. They had something. And suddenly, It didn't matter what he had uncovered. What truths were still waiting in the dark. The weight of the night's events had just crashed down on him with brutal finality. He was no longer just a grieving husband caught in the storm. He was a suspect. The officers reached for him, but before they could grab his wrists, a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't, Daniel." James turned just as Daniel stepped forward, his hands raised, his eyes burning with something James hadn't seen before. Desperation. "He didn't do this," Daniel said firmly, looking straight at Hale. "You don't understand what's happening here." Hale didn't flinch. "Then help me understand," she countered. "Because right now, the evidence says otherwise." Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for James to see it. The crack in his certainty. The fear. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something colder. "You think you have everything figured out." Daniel's voice was steady, but his hands trembled at his sides. "You're looking at the wrong man, and if you take him in, you'll be playing right into their hands." Silence fell, the kind that stretched, unbearable and thick. James felt his own breath hitch as something unspoken passed between Daniel and Hale. And then, as if something invisible clicked into place, Hale exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I need something more than cryptic warnings, Daniel." Daniel took a step closer to her, lowering his voice. "You're looking for the wrong fingerprints." The weapon wasn't planted to frame James. It was planted to silence him. A slow ripple of unease passed through the room. James could feel it, see it in the way Hal's jaw tightened. For the first time, hesitation flickered in her eyes. And then the choice. James knew, in that moment, that he had two options. He could let them take him in, let himself be swallowed by the weight of false evidence, and risk being buried in a crime he didn't commit. Or he could run. He could take Daniel's warning for what it was, a lifeline. A desperate attempt to keep him from walking into a trap he might never escape from. His pulse pounded in his ears. If he ran, he would become a fugitive, hunted as the prime suspect in his own wife's murder. But if he stayed, if he let himself be cuffed and led away, the real killers would win. And James had a gut-wrenching feeling that if that happened, he would never make it out alive. Daniel hesitated, his face pale. "I don't know, but I think Ethan did." The words sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over James. Ethan missing, unreachable, possibly dead. Had he uncovered the truth Olivia had been hiding? Was that why he had vanished? Had he been trying to warn James all along? Or worse, had he been part of it? Before James could press for more, a loud noise erupted downstairs, a crash, followed by the distant sound of voices raised in panic. Daniel flinched, stepping back. "They know we're talking." James barely had time to process the warning before Daniel turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving James standing there, gripping a note that suddenly felt like a death sentence. The truth was unraveling, but with every answer came a new, more terrifying question. And now, he wasn't just searching for the truth, he was trying to stay alive long enough to uncover it. James barely had time to think before the shouting downstairs grew louder, followed by a rush of footsteps. He could feel the tension shift, the air thick with an urgency that told him something had just gone terribly wrong. His grip tightened around the crumpled note in his hand as he moved toward the staircase, his heart hammering so hard it almost drowned out the noise below. He expected chaos, panic, but what he didn't expect was the look on Detective Hale's face when their eyes met across the dimly lit foyer. There was no longer controlled suspicion in her gaze. There was certainty. Cold, unforgiving. And it was aimed right at him. "James Carter," her voice rang out, steady but sharp. "You need to come with us." Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward him. The guests, who remained shell-shocked, exhausted, watched in silence, their faces pale and unreadable. The officers flanking Hale stepped forward, and that's when James saw it. the zip-tie cuffs. His stomach turned to stone. "What the hell is this?" James demanded, but even as he spoke, he knew. He didn't need to ask. Whatever had just happened, whatever new evidence had come to light, it had led them to him. Hale's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. Pity? Regret? It made his skin crawl. "We have reason to believe you're withholding information. We recovered a second murder weapon, one with your fingerprints on it." James felt the room tilt. His mind screamed that it wasn't possible, that this was a mistake. But the logical part of him knew this wasn't a bluff. They had something. And suddenly, it didn't matter what he had uncovered, what truths were still waiting in the dark. The weight of the night's events had just crashed down on him with brutal finality. He was no longer just a grieving husband caught in the storm. He was a suspect. The officers reached for him, but before they could grab his wrists, a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't. Daniel." James turned just as Daniel stepped forward, his hands raised, his eyes burning with something James hadn't seen before. Desperation. "He didn't do this," Daniel said firmly, looking straight at Hale. "You don't understand what's happening here." Hale didn't flinch. "Then help me understand," she countered. "Because right now, the evidence says otherwise." Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for James to see it. The crack in his certainty. The fear. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something colder. "You think you have everything figured out." Daniel's voice was steady, but his hands trembled at his sides. "You're looking at the wrong man. And if you take him in, you'll be playing right into their hands." Silence fell. The kind that stretched, unbearable and thick. James felt his own breath hitch as something unspoken passed between Daniel and Hale. And then, as if something invisible clicked into place, Hale exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I need something more than cryptic warnings, Daniel." Daniel took a step closer to her, lowering his voice. "You're looking for the wrong fingerprints." The weapon wasn't planted to frame James. It was planted to silence him. A slow ripple of unease passed through the room. James could feel it, see it in the way Hale's jaw tightened. For the first time, hesitation flickered in her eyes. And then the choice. James knew, in that moment, that he had two options. He could let them take him in, let himself be swallowed by the weight of false evidence, and risk being buried in a crime he didn't commit. Or he could run. He could take Daniel's warning for what it was, a lifeline. A desperate attempt to keep him from walking into a trap he might never escape from. His pulse pounded in his ears. If he ran, he would become a fugitive, hunted as the prime suspect in his own wife's murder. But if he stayed, if he let himself be cuffed and led away, the real killers would win. And James had a gut-wrenching feeling that if that happened, he would never make it out alive. His decision came in a split second. The moment the officers reached for him again, James moved. And then, the chaos truly began. The moment James bolted, time seemed to shatter around him. Shouts erupted behind him, but his instincts took over, his feet hitting the marble floor with a force that sent vibrations through his bones. The mansion blurred past him, the chandeliers overhead casting fractured light as he pushed through the nearest doorway. He didn't have a plan, just the overwhelming certainty that if he let them take him, he wouldn't live long enough to see a trial. Hands lunged for him, but he twisted away, barely slipping past an officer, before crashing through a side exit into the cold night air. The wind hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the night, every cryptic warning, every missing piece of the puzzle that was just starting to take shape. Olivia's death wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't about jealousy or betrayal. It was something bigger, something darker, something she had tried to escape. And now, someone was making sure that everyone who got too close was either dead or conveniently removed from the picture. A car screeched nearby, headlights flashing as tires skidded against the pavement. For one wild second, James thought it was the police, but then the back door of the vehicle swung open and a familiar voice hissed from inside. "Get in. Now, Daniel." James didn't hesitate. He dove into the car just as it peeled away, the adrenaline in his veins making every nerve feel electric. The streetlights streaked past, the night stretching out before them as the mansion disappeared in the distance. His breath came hard and fast, his pulse still hammering in his ears, but Daniel's expression grim-set made his stomach turn with a different kind of dread. "They were never going to let you walk out of there," Daniel said, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You were already convicted the second Olivia was killed." James swallowed, his mouth dry. "You knew this was going to happen." It wasn't a question. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a sharp turn onto an empty back road, the darkness closing in around them like a shroud. Then finally, in a voice laced with something James couldn't quite place guilt, maybe he said, "I knew they had their eyes on you, but I didn't know how far they'd go." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This isn't just about Olivia. It never was." James felt his stomach twist. "Then what the hell is it about?" Daniel's hands flexed on the wheel. "Control. Power. She was supposed to marry someone else, James. She was supposed to be part of something bigger. And when she chose you, she was signing her own death sentence." His voice tightened. "She thought love would be enough to save her. But they don't let people walk away." The car was suffocatingly silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in like a stone. James could barely breathe. This wasn't just about Olivia's past. This was about an entire network, people who dictated outcomes, who decided who lived and who didn't. And Olivia, whether she had meant to or not, had crossed a line. Then a horrifying thought struck him. Who? His voice came out hoarse. Who was she supposed to marry? Daniel hesitated just a little too long. And then James knew. The pieces slammed together with a force that nearly knocked the air from his lungs. The cancelled wedding. The whispers of fear in Olivia's voice whenever she talked about the past. The way Ethan had tried to warn him, tried to get him to see. And then, finally, the way Daniel had been there, always watching, always knowing more than he should. James turned to him, his entire body ice cold. "It was you." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the wheel even harder. It wasn't supposed to be like this. James felt like he was going to be sick. His oldest friend, the person he had trusted, the one who had saved him from being arrested, had been part of this from the start. "You knew," James choked out. "You knew she wasn't safe, and you let me believe he cut himself off, the betrayal hitting him like a punch to the gut. You were one of them." Daniel's knuckles turned bone white. "Not like you think." His voice was sharp, but there was something in it, something unraveling. "I tried to stop it. I tried to protect her. But when she chose you, I had to make a choice too." His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for the first time, James noticed the dark SUV trailing behind them, headlights dimmed but steady. Following. Tracking. James's breath hitched. They weren't running. They were being herded. Daniel let out a long breath. "I can get you out of this, James. But you need to listen to me." James stared at him, at the man he thought he knew, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was sitting next to his savior or his executioner. "You said." The road stretched out before them, dark and endless, but James wasn't fooled. They weren't running anymore. They were being led. The SUV behind them kept its distance, but it was there watching, waiting. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned to Daniel, his mind racing through every possible way this could end. There weren't many that ended with him alive. "You need to trust me," Daniel said, his voice tight, focused. "I can fix this." James let out a hollow laugh, his hands clenching into fists. "Trust you?" The words tasted bitter on his tongue. "You've been lying to me this entire time. You were supposed to marry her. You knew what they would do to her, and you let it happen." His voice cracked, raw with grief, with betrayal. "You stood by while they killed my wife." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened, but his voice remained steady. "And you think I haven't paid for that? You think I haven't been fighting to keep you alive from the second they set their sights on you?" He swerved the car suddenly, veering onto a narrow, deserted path. The SUV behind them reacting instantly, speeding up in pursuit. "You don't get it, James. They don't just kill people. They erase them." Olivia's death wasn't the end of their plan. It was the beginning. James's stomach twisted with a terrible realization. Then what is the end? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he yanked the wheel hard to the left, sending the car skidding onto a gravel road leading to an abandoned estate. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark, its structure long forgotten, but James knew. This wasn't random. This was planned. The SUV behind them cut its headlights, rolling to a slow, deliberate stop just a few feet away. The air was thick, suffocating. James could barely breathe as Daniel put the car in park, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached into his jacket. James moved before he could think. He grabbed Daniel's wrist, shoving him back against the seat. "If you pull a gun on me, you better be ready to use it," he growled, his voice low, dangerous. He was done playing games. Done being led around like a pawn. Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly opened his hand and revealed a key. James blinked. "What the hell is that?" "The last piece of the puzzle," Daniel murmured. "Olivia left it for you." James felt the world tilt. "No, that's impossible." "She didn't. She knew they were coming for her, James. She knew she didn't have much time." Daniel's voice softened, but there was urgency in his words. "She didn't run because she thought she could stop them. She thought she had proof that could tear them apart." He pressed the key into James's hand, his gaze unwavering. "That proof is in there." He nodded toward the abandoned house. James's heart pounded against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run in the opposite direction. This had to be a trap. But then he thought about Olivia. About the way she had looked at him that last night, her eyes full of something he hadn't understood until now. She had known. Without another word, he shoved the car door open, the cold air biting against his skin as he stepped out. The SUV doors opened as well, figures emerging, their presence heavy, suffocating. James felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself forward, gripping the key so tightly his knuckles ached. Daniel followed, his movements slow, cautious. They reached the entrance. The door groaned as James pushed it open, revealing a dust-coated hallway, the air stale with time. The house was silent, too silent. His fingers trembled as he reached for the lockbox Daniel had led him to, tucked beneath a rotting floorboard. The key fit perfectly. With a click, the lid sprang open. Inside was a flash drive. James stared at it, his breath shallow. It was so small, so unassuming. But he knew this was it. The thing Olivia had died for. The shadows shifted behind him. And then a voice, cold and familiar, shattered the silence. "Step away from the box." James froze. Slowly, he turned. Ethan. His best friend. The one person who had warned him, who had tried to steer him away from this nightmare. But now, as he stood there, gun raised, his face was unreadable.